So welcome to our July webinar, Data for Equitable Systems Change. And we've got a jam-packed agenda. We want to make sure we also get you the best information for your work, but we also want to know that people are busy. So we're going to get going and get us moving. Oh, somebody says we can't type in the chat. Oops, thanks for letting us know. I'm sure it's a setting. We'll get somebody in the technical team to check it out. In the meantime, it looks like you guys figured out how to type in other in other places. So by all means, you can type in the Q&A then if the chat doesn't work. But we'll see if we can fix that and communicate with you guys through the chat. Thanks for letting us know. So land acknowledgement, as I said, I'm joining you today from Treaty 6, and that's a really historic day today for the Pope's apology for survivors of residential schooling. But I'm sure you can take the time to reflect on the territory that you're joining us from as well. And hopefully once we get the chat up and running, we can also learn where that is. So today's speakers, of course, I like to insert myself everywhere because I have lots to say about everything. But we've got Wendy, and she's going to be joining us from Diversity Institute, Toronto Metropolitan University. I think we shared the bios in the registration already, so I don't need to go over her mass accomplishments. And yeah, it's an unbelievable body of work she's done in this space. Taylor Sparkling Eyes from our team as well, and she'll share some on the ground work with First Nations in Kelowna. And then Sylvia from Tamarack Institute, and lots of folks I'm sure are familiar there. And it looks like the chat's good to go now. Let's see. You guys can give that a go. So in terms of the agenda and what's on tap, obviously this intro, we're going to get a bit of an overview of why systems change is relevant when we talk about data and equitable systems change. So I've asked Sylvia to help us out with that. She's like the super expert in this. Then we're going to move to Wendy and her remarks from the Diversity Institute's perspective, and they've done some incredible policy work in this area as well. From our end, we do technology and data, so would love to share some of our learnings from putting this into practice as well. So Taylor and I will do that. And of course, if you've got a pressing question, we know we have an action-packed webinar today, so it says drop it in the chat. I don't know if the chat is working, but you can drop it in the Q&A. So once these ladies are taking over the presentation, we'll play around and see if we can get that enabled. If not, you can drop it in it looks like the question and answer does work. So you can make sure we answer it in our remarks, or we can also follow up with you if there's something super, super pressing. Make sure we get what you get what you need out of this. So a couple of things you're going to walk away with: better ideas around how to apply new data sets and data trends to social change, data and analytics, and how we can identify inequities in our social infrastructure across diverse dimensions, including gender, indigeneity, racial identities, and more. And then, of course, the important role of community mobilization using data in system efforts. So you're going to hear some examples from different vantage points on that front. So it's not by all means the be all end all. This is really a kind of flavor bursts from a nice assortment of insights that we have. So by all means, you can reach out to us for more info if some of these things pop up as pressing for you. But hopefully this gives you a nice overview of what the topic's all about and what folks in the space are thinking about right now. So Sylvia, I'm going to hand it over to you. Each speaker is going to have about 10 minutes for their remarks, and then we'll get into the Q&As as well. So
Beautiful. Thank you so much. I can't tell you how much I appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to be part of this panel. I swear I'm going to learn as much or more when I came in. Now, Alina, I'm going to have to get you, if you don't mind, to stop your screen share, and then I'll pull my. I'm crossing face. Second, put it on our screen so you can actually see it, is my hope. So I wanted to start by kind of just creating a shared understanding of what do we mean by systems change. And a lovely way to think about it is to distinguish it from programmatic change, which is the thing that many of us in service delivery organizations are likely most familiar with. And I remember this kind of distinction being really brought to my attention at an event we were hosting, where one of the speakers talked about the fact that, we keep investing in programs and getting annoyed that the systems don't change. And the revelation is that's not fair. If you really need to change systems, then you need to be very intentional about creating system change strategies that parallel and augment efforts to introduce new programs. And in terms of a definition, I think the definitions that resonate for me the most, and they kind of complement each other. The first is from Karen Pittman from the Forum for Youth Investment, where she says a program intervention will help a person to beat the odds, but a systemic intervention seeks to change the odds for everyone. And Tim Drayman from Social Innovation Generation says, really to understand what we're talking about in terms of systems change is to really understand what are the conditions that we are co-creating that hold somebody stuck in an issue, and how might we change those? So I'm not going to read through this whole thing, but you'll get these slides afterwards. But it really does emphasize through the lens of poverty and the story of a mother whose child is perpetually in the emergency room suffering from asthma due to mold found in her, the apartment. How it creates this cascade that ultimately, keeps that family in poverty. So they can't actually move out of the home that is causing all the difficulty in the first place. And we as service providers can probably work out a beautiful solution to help that parent and child navigate their reality. But if we're looking across a city and see that there are 10,000 families exactly like this one who are struggling in similar ways, then clearly our approach together to address it needs to look different. And to further set context from my perspective, I think one of the things I've been hearing a lot lately is that COVID really, if there was a silver lining, one is a growing consensus that our current systems are inadequate with the challenges that individuals and communities are facing. And Meg Wheatley, years ago actually, wrote this beautiful article where she refers to this unique subgroup of people in our communities known as paradigm pioneers. And these are the individuals working in these systems who really see those limitations and the need to upgrade and or add new things to our systems to help them become more robust in today's reality. And this is their work. And I love that quote by Buckminster Fuller you see there, where where and how we advance change is often by creating a new system that actually attracts attention away from the current inadequate one, rather than fighting and railing against the limitations of the previous system. So our friends at FSG, who are co-authors of Collective Impact, a disciplined form of multi-sector collaboration, actually identify 3 different layers to think about in terms of systemic change and or barriers. And so that top level, the most visible and obvious, are things like changes in policy. And these could be municipal, provincial, federal, but they can also be organizational policies. Also shifts and changes in practice. If we think about things like the land acknowledgement, right? That's a practice that is more widely being adopted, and it signals a very different mindset and shift and commitment, which is critical. Resource flows is another very tangible example of systemic change, but on a more subtle, less obvious-ish level, it's also looking at relationships and connections and how we address and acknowledge power dynamics And at the end of the day, sort of the nirvana, which takes significant time to get there, are shifting people's mental models, which are really our attitudes and our behaviors that guide what we think about contributing to a particular issue or challenge that we're trying to address. So as community leaders, some of the challenges that we're facing then are how might we think differently together? And that in such a way that we better understand the systemic dynamics that are affecting the issue we're trying to change, and learn, strengthen our ability to think more broadly and frankly, innovatively about what's needed to create more high impact opportunities and recognize the interconnectedness between issues and that we can positively impact multiple issues simultaneously. If you haven't kind of checked out this notion of multi-solving, that's an excellent framework and example to illustrate that last bullet. So the challenge for all of us, though, as we come at some of these complex social issues, is no one sector alone holds all the answers. And in fact, as we even gather diverse sector leaders together to explore new options for addressing these systemic barriers, we ourselves are blinded by our own mental models, by who we have relationships with and whose perspective helps shape our understanding of the issue and our perceptions of power. Do I have the courage, the ability to speak out or not? And so bringing people together and actually having dialogues in which we can create a shared understanding and become more aware of our own biases is a critical part of that journey. And to really, in Tamarack's experience, help those dialogues be rich and informative, we need two distinct types of folks at the same table talking to one another. The first are those subject matter content experts who bring a certain knowledge and experience to the conversation about the issue, but equally important are the need to bring context experts to the table. So those are individuals in a particular community who can tell you how this issue shows up specifically in their community. And most importantly, the folks who are living and breathing this issue within the community on a regular basis. They can tell you where the vulnerabilities are. They can show you and help understand where those leverage points for systemic change may lie. So as I think about this beautiful opportunity that you've created in terms of accessible data and data drawn together from multiple subsets, I can see how it contributes very strongly to helping those diverse perspectives establish a shared understanding of the current reality. Like, where are we at? I think having comparators, so how are we doing relative to community A, B, or C, is another element that I think can be highlighted through this use of data. And I think it also supports individuals from diverse sectors to have a starting point to begin to make sense of this issue that they mutually care about. It can also help us, often when you're trying to make systemic change happen, it feels like trying to eat an elephant, right? And so having access to data can be really useful in helping us then to determine where are the first bites, like what's the priority we need to focus on to start. We can also use it over time to demonstrate that our efforts are making progress, and that needs to be celebrated. And then ultimately, we can also conversely use it to say, are the strategies that we're working on actually effective in terms of advancing systemic change? And that I think the other piece for me is the importance of integrating both qualitative stories from lived experience folks and the quantitative data. Also think that data presents us with as we kind of intentionally pull it into dialogues around systems change. One of the things that I am recognizing is data does give us clarity, but it won't help us completely avoid the messiness of advancing systems change. And I think folks, those kinds of efforts need to know that going in. And making sense of data and what it means is essential and can always help inform how we might act on it. Data can still be biased and still affected by power dynamics. It can be, to be selected, it must be meaningful to various sectors, and it must be credible, reliable, and consistently available. And I think the other piece for me is that often what I've seen is there are pieces of data we're hungry for and they just don't exist. And so that's another limitation. So what are the, I couldn't think of this word yesterday, but the marker, like the alternatives that we're going to look at in terms of understanding the issue. So lastly, I think I want to kind of just highlight for you, as you think about yourself as a systems change activist, some of these are 5 great lessons that I think we can all take to heart as we look at data and think of advancing these kinds of changes. We need to find our allies, right? Who are the folks that understand the systems better than we do? And how might we connect with them and also senior leaders and policymakers, because they are the ones who can really take our learning and multiply it. Look for pressure points. You can't do everything all at once. So which elements of our system are most under pressure or underperforming? Because those are places where we can most likely advance change. Also, you gotta actually be compassionate that nobody sets out from a systems lens to do harm or to be part of the barrier. And so we need to have compassion, not blame, when we draw them into these conversations with us. And, you know, don't put all your eggs in one basket. We always fall into this trap of thinking there's a single silver bullet, and if we find it, everything's going to cascade into place. But the reality is most effective systems change efforts actually are the result of braiding together a number of small components and quite diverse experiments to shift systems. And so we need to really be aware of that. And then finally, you know, just remaining flexible and relentless. Like if you bump into a barrier, okay, how do you divert? And again, this is a place where I think data might also be very useful in helping us adapt over time. And so that's kind of a stage setter, if you like, for how I think about all of this. And now I just want to turn it back.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thanks everybody for your patience with the chat. It looks like we figured it out. Good news. Good news. Thank you so much, Sylvia. I think that's a really nice framing for folks who are, you know, talking about systems change and data. And sometimes we forget what exactly we're talking about to begin with. So I love that, because that's exactly what Travis said yesterday when we were working through this is, well, who's going to do the setting the stage? And I said, it's okay, Sylvia's got it. So that was a beautiful setting the stage component to Wendy's remarks as well. So Wendy, it's over to you. Hopefully you can share your screen, no problem. And we'll there you go. We'll hand you the floor.
I'm just trying to, there, can you see my slides?
Good to go.
So my name's Wendy Cukier. I lead the Diversity Institute. I'm joining you from the traditional territory of the Mississauga of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat, and the Chippewa peoples. And I am at the university formerly known as Ryerson, now Toronto Metropolitan University. And I think the fact we went through a process and changed our name is an indication of the commitment of the institution to truth and reconciliation. And certainly it's become a much more important piece of the work we do at the Diversity Institute. So we're in a business school, and that shapes the approach that we take to change. We're also, we're now 130 full-time people who work on a variety of different projects, all of which have systems change components. So we're the research lead for the Future Skills Center. We lead the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub, which is focused on creating an inclusive ecosystem for women and diverse entrepreneurs. We're leading the 50-30 Challenge, which is focusing on representation on boards and in senior leadership roles. We run a number of programs targeting women living in poverty and newcomers and refugees and women in technology and so on. So we have a range of initiatives, some which are pure research, some which are applied research, and some which are programmatic. And I would argue that data and evidence underpin all of them. And evidence is not always data, which is, I think, another thing to emphasize. So I wanted to just pull a few examples of how we apply both systems approaches as well as data to our work around diversity and inclusion. And as I said, full disclosure, I am in a business school. And while we have a deep commitment to social justice in all the work we do, at the same time, our experience has been that if you are trying to speak to people who do not agree with you or share your views on the priority of diversity, equity, and inclusion, trying to figure out how it aligns with their self-interests on multiple levels may be a useful lever. And so we ground what we do in what we call the business case, whether we're dealing with health organizations, educational institutions, governments, or Starbucks. And what we mean by that is focusing on what organizations' key goals and objectives are, and then trying to link diversity and inclusion to those things. So whether it's access to talent, and in the current environment, that's a big issue, whether it's responding to changes in marketplaces, and that applies whether you're government or the private sector, whether it's driving innovation, creativity, and so on, or improving the employee experience, which again, in the current environment, retention is a huge issue. And we know that there's good evidence to support that. And if that's not enough, there's also the risks associated with getting it wrong and what happens when people take action. The approach that we use is actually grounded in public health. And we term it an ecological model. And what that references is the fact that there are no simple solutions to complex problems. And so if we look at equity, diversity, and inclusion as a complex problem, we have to understand the system that is to a certain extent historic, is baked in at the societal level to our assumptions, our stereotypes, our policies, our structures. And whether we're talking about legislative actions or specific programs like access to childcare, or whether we're talking about access to running water and high-speed internet, those are issues that have to be dealt with arguably at the systems level. Similarly, when we look at stereotypes and so on. Then at the next layer, there are organizational actions. So organizations exist in a context, but they can make decisions about policies and programs that can have an impact both on the individuals working in those organizations, but also the broader systems. And at the end of the day, of course, individuals make choices and behave in a variety of ways that have influence up and also down. The reason we think this model is powerful is because when you look at the diversity and inclusion human rights space, there's often a real divide between people who are arguing for systemic change and structural change, and those who are often characterized as neoliberal, who are focused on individual empowerment. And the beauty we have found with using the ecological model is it provides a framework that allows people to come together. And, the analogy was used of different pieces of the elephant. This way, someone can be really focused on coaching and mentoring and training individuals and find a place. And someone can be focused on, dismantling colonialism and find a place. And we see this as being quite powerful in bringing different groups' perspectives together. So I'll give you 3 cases of how we've used data and how it links to systems change. Diversity Leads is a project we've done for a number of years. since 2008 with initially with the Maitrey Foundation. And our big finding, I won't go into all of the detail, but the study looks at representation in leadership, boards, C-suite, nonprofits, corporate, education, politics, civil service, and education agencies, boards, and commissions. And we disaggregate the data. We can show, for example, that within group differences, some corporations have more than 40% women, some have none on their boards. Tells you that it is not the pool. You know, we hear often, I like women, my wife's a woman, my daughter's a woman, but there are no women. It's very helpful in showing that intentionality can produce results. But a couple of points were very important in the study. One was we discovered in looking at corporate boards in the Greater Toronto Area, where half the population is racialized, white women outnumbered racialized women 17-1 on corporate boards, even though they were 1-1 in the organization. The other important data point was we disaggregated the racialized data and looked specifically at Black people in leadership roles. And of 1,600 corporate positions across Canada, we found exactly 9 Black men and 4 Black women. So that work became very important in shaping Bill C-25, which governs federally regulated distributing corporations, because historically there was huge focus on women on boards, the 30% club, women, women, women. I'm a woman. I think gender is an important lens. But when we started looking at the intersectional data that showed gross inequities, we were able to lobby to get Bill C-25 to include the 4 equity groups. It's not perfect, but it puts Canada at the forefront of moving beyond gender. So that was one example. And what came from that was also a voluntary code called the 50-30 Challenge, which we're currently working on, which is targeting organizations to commit to gender parity, 50%, and increased representation of Indigenous peoples, racialized people, including those who are Black, persons with disability, and those who identify as 2S LGBTQ, on their boards or in leadership roles, whether they're nonprofits, for-profits, big or small. And I would argue there's a linear connection between data that we collected and commitments that the government has made around these issues, and there are 1,500 organizations that signed up so far. Second example is the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub. And a lot of people focus on things like women entrepreneurs and say, okay, we'll create a fund for the girls, right? And to me, women entrepreneurs are like lady doctors. If you're calling them women entrepreneurs, you're treating them as separate. And our goal was to not just provide special programming for women, because without question, they need it right now, but also to really tackle some of the systemic barriers that are baked into the system. So just 2 data points on this that are important. Women are less than 16% of majority owners of small, medium enterprises in Canada. That's about 100,000 companies, okay? But women are 37% of self-employed Canadians. That's 1 million. All of the government programs of note defined entrepreneur as someone with an incorporated business, i.e. majority owners of small, medium enterprises, did not look at people who are self-employed. This had implications for women, for Black entrepreneurs, for Indigenous entrepreneurs, because there are disincentives to incorporate because of the tax structure. and it was not seen in the policies. So when it came to, for example, COVID relief, the programs were designed for SMEs with employees, which were primarily not owned by women or those other groups. So by using these data points to illustrate systemic bias in the system, we were able to get shifts in ways we look at entrepreneurs. And again, the intersectional lens was hugely important. This was a study that looked at members of the Canadian Federation of Independent Business versus members of the Black Business Professional Association. And I won't go through it, but all you need to do is look at the last line. Lack capacity to take on debt, 56% of CFIB members, 96% of BPPA members. What were the government relief programs designed as primarily? Loans. And this perspective has been very important in work, for example, we've been doing in advocating for forgivable loans, micro grants, et cetera, because we know more than half of businesses in Canada start with $5,000, and yet it would be easier to get $5,000 or the equivalent in Bangladesh than it is in Canada. The other thing that this relates to is, of course, stereotypes. And so we've done a lot of work to try to tackle that assumption, because if you equate entrepreneur with Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, Elon Musk, you exclude women. Who thinks of Celine Dion as a mogul? She's worth $800 million. Final case, if I have time, do I have time for one more? Okay. Final case is the diversity and inclusion assessment tool that we use on an organizational basis, where we look at governance and leadership, we look at human resources, we look at values and culture, we look at diversity across the value chain, we look at partnerships and so on, but we also look at metrics. And the metrics have to drive the strategy, because what gets measured gets done, even though not everything we can measure is important. And we've worked with nonprofits, for-profits, governments, and so on in using the tool and really focusing on how we measure and assess these different areas within the organization. So representation in terms of leadership and governance, employee engagement surveys intersecting with identity data to assess culture, HR practices looking at representation, recruitment processes and so on. But even in the value chain, looking at procurement, looking at where people spend their money, because lots of organizations will wave the rainbow flags and sign up for the pledges. But if you ask them where they're putting their money, it isn't into women-led or diverse businesses. And so we think it's really important that organizations large and small put their money where their mouth is. And this focus on trying to really dig into what organizations do and apply an equity diversity lens to every single piece of the process is critically important, because if you don't have an equity, diversity, and inclusion lens to your R&D, for example, you design cars that kill more women because they were tested with crash test dummies based on men. So you have to have this lens in everything that you do. And we also recognize that the numbers aren't enough. And so we try as well to share lived experience. And the Micropedia of Microaggressions, which is spelt wrong, was one of the very successful tools that we developed that allow people to essentially walk in another's shoes without putting an emotional burden on people to share their experience as a woman in a male-dominated environment, as a Black person in a white dominated environment. So from our perspective, There's lots of research that suggests diversity and inclusion drives innovation, but we also think that we can take what we know about innovation, about technology adoption, about systems change, and apply it to driving diversity and inclusion. Thank you very much.
That was great. That was great. I love how we're also highlighting the tools that folks can look up. And if you have ideas and want to take some of these forward to your leaders, et cetera, we're giving you some of these resources in the chat. I saw folks dropping those in there. So I guess it's our turn, Taylor. No pressure after Wendy and Sylvia's wonderful presentation. Ladies, thank you so much. So for us, I think we'll start with a bit of a, where are we coming from in this space? And we're obviously a data and technology social innovation company, so we have a bit of a different lens here. But some of the learnings that we've had, and we've been around for about 4 years, and essentially building some of the tools that folks in the social sector are using to advance systems change, and we focus on data-driven tools. And in that perspective, there's been 4, I would say, takeaways from our end. And I'm going to dig a little deeper into the nerd parts, and then we're going to come out and talk about the community engagement side of this. That's more people centric. But when it comes to the data, I really appreciated, Wendy, when you said that you need to look at the entire kind of supply chain. And for us, even starting with the data sources, so we have technology where we take tons and tons of data from very diverse entry points, and we mash it together to make sense of it. And in that process, though, understanding the kind of the biography of that data set and how it was created and the biases that come with that data set has been huge in terms of applying that equity, diversity, inclusion, and reconciliation lens. This ability to do that disaggregation and having the disaggregation capability built into the technology from the get-go versus as an afterthought is another piece of learning that we've had. For those of you that are building technology tools or are in the data space, that's really, really critical too. And ideally these pieces line up. So you're not taking in data that was collected unethically from certain populations, but it's got really, really good ability to disaggregate for certain subgroups that you might be interested in. So it's kind of cancels itself out. Ideally, these pieces line up. Another piece that I'll highlight too, and when we apply natural language processing, for instance, we have to create thousands and thousands of synonyms so that we teach that algorithm to pick up the right things to be able to give us insights into this mass data. But person-centered language extraction is not something that's usual. Whenever you look at some of these data sets there, and I'll use the example of somebody that's engaged in crime or has experience with the justice system, that would be a person-centered way of speaking about it, or somebody that's experiencing mental health challenges or homelessness. When you look at the synonyms in the kind of the data field and natural science fields that are dominating the space, it's all the criminal, the dangerous person. Like that change hasn't happened over there. So even by introducing person-centered language in our language extraction, it's been a challenge, and we've had to create so much of the stuff ourselves to enable the ability to draw out those insights. And then, of course, the querying representations in the end visualization. So, a really, really great example might be seeing the LGBTQ2S plus being a small number of hits in a data set, and then saying, well, it's not really a thing. Let's just put it away. But the ability to create a way in your visualizations to show that has been and the diversity within such a small percentage and how important that is to identity has again been a challenge to us as a technology company. So I thought it'd probably just be best to show you guys what I'm talking about. So I'll show you here. This is one of the products where we bring in all these diverse data sets and then we mash them together. So one that I thought would be probably the most interesting is when we look at resource flows. So I love that. And sorry, my internet's a little bit slow today. When we look at resource flows from that equity lens, and here we can query the data to look at, for instance, looking at things by, let's say, gender and sexuality, because we were just chatting about that. You can start to dissect the millions and where the money's actually going, right? And to start to looking at things comparatively as well, right? The other one would be, we talked about indigeneity as well. So again, having the ability to even draw this data out and to figure out a way to visualize it, to tell these stories, as you can see right in front of you how stark this is. When you actually look at resource flows. So while we might be talking about representation of data and to be able to talk about what's happening in a particular community from a general perspective, such as Statistics Canada's demographics profiles, when you actually look at resource flows, when you look at it from a systems lens perspective, it becomes way more interesting and way more stark the way you visualize it. I'll show you another one that I think is interesting too. And this one is let's take a look at homelessness. So when the data that comes in here is really live data from our end users. But if we, again, let's say add Indigenous, you can see how this completely changes the map of where people are searching for support. So again, having this ability to dig in and apply an intersectional lens to data in real time is what we're excited for. But to do this, like I said, back to the insights, we've had to come up with some tools that just weren't there. And I feel like we need more folks to be talking about the technicalities of doing this work in the technology and data space with us as well, to learn from each other. So that's a little bit about this piece. I do have a couple of additional slides that I wanted to share that Taylor's going to also be speaking to, but I'll set it up for her because that might be the easiest way to get there. Sorry about that. I just have to toggle between slide decks. And a reminder for folks, if you've got kind of burning questions as well, to type them up in the chat, and we'll make sure we get to you. There's the machinery as well. If you were wondering where all the data comes from and the engine it goes to, and what you were looking at is this one product called Carto, but there's other ones as well if you want to take a look at other pieces on a HelpSeeker.co site. So the project that I'm going to have Taylor speak to is really picking up on this concept of systems mapping or supply mapping. And the project that she did in Kelowna is actually part of a bigger initiative for us to map the supply of social supports across Canada that was funded by Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, and most recently got ramped up by Supercluster to create this unifying data set for us to understand what the supply looks like, and to be able to do that work that I showed you of understanding where we have an imbalance of supply demand and what those resource flows look like. So it's that product I showed you is powered by this data that we had to create from scratch just because it didn't exist before. And in the process of creating that data, we have to do a whole lot of R&D because it hasn't been done before. So the way we do this R&D is with community. And so this is an example of a project that we did in community. So it's this ongoing research and development with folks with lived and living experience. It's we're highlighting this one just in alignment with one of our core values. And you were talking about core values too, Wendy. One of our core values is commitment to reconciliation, inclusion, diversity, equity, and sovereignty. And so what does that look like at all of those stages in our R&D process is why we're highlighting this piece. another example of some of the practical pieces we've done just to ramp ourselves up that might be useful for other folks is to get perhaps non-traditional folks in your team, data scientists, for instance, or software engineers, to get them OCAP certified to understand data sovereignty from an Indigenous lens. Having a First Nations data policy, something that we also have. The other one is to integrate some of the calls to actions from the TRC into our product, so that we're not just building, we're building to the TRC calls to action. That's again the stuff that I showed you is implications from that. When you look at the TRC, you'll be surprised how much data is being called for in that document. It's actually quite impressive. But that's all the stuff that we've done, and there's yet so much more we're learning. So I'm gonna hand it over to Taylor to talk about the Kelowna Friendship Center project and how that one came about and what data looks like when you're actually in community with community, because it's not so magical that you just wave your wand and now you've got disaggregated data on that you can do all this intersectional analysis and build cool products to drive systems change. It has to come from somewhere, and you can't lose that context. So over to you, Taylor.
Awesome. Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Alina, for that introduction on the integrated coordinated access model that we created in partnership with Kelowna Friendship Society. You can just go to the next slide, though. So for the Indigenous coordinated access, we really got into the ground and embedded our research and development with the local knowledge keepers, local elders. It was blessed in ceremony at the beginning and end of the project, which was super awesome to see that being included in our work. So throughout the model, we had created an Indigenous working group, which consisted of members from Kelowna's community with living and or lived experience to be part of this committee that really tailored the way we created this model. And it was based on all their feedback and really captured in CELIX knowledge and CELIX teachings that were shared to our team from local knowledge keepers, which was awesome to see. It is embedded throughout the model and the process. So that includes things such as Indigenous selection circles, a lead Indigenous facilitator. We had a lot of partnerships from different organizations in Kelowna jump on board who were really excited to get and be part of this process. We made a lot of connections with external allies. We suggested that the model does include an elder in residence to inform and really keep those traditional ways of knowing, being, doing in line with this model moving forward in Kelowna. We also suggested that the paths process out of Wabano is included with the ICA model. So throughout this project, we really did transform the way that traditional research and development and design is being done in communities by really getting on the ground and embedding the work we did with the local voices and perspectives of those Indigenous peoples in the CELIX community. And we did reach out to the local First Nations to be involved in this project, but they're super busy. So unfortunately, during our short turnaround that they weren't able to be involved, but we are hoping that Kelowna Friendship Society does engage them to have them involved and really bring those OCAP principles into this ICA model moving forward. Go to the next slide. So to gather all the knowledge in community, we held 7 different working groups with the Indigenous working group, and we really got their feedback and based the model off of what they wanted to have done. So it was really co-creation on their end within community members who are the ones in the front line doing this work on the day-to-day basis. We had, sorry, I don't think everything on this slide is right, but we also had closing and opening ceremonies with the elders and Kelowna Friendship Society really did make sure that this work was blessed and rooted in ceremony. And from our side, we did receive a lot of pushback from trying to include more Indigenous ways of reporting. So we did include a lot of oral reporting in the final report of the ICA. And our team was super great at getting that all together and trying to tie those traditional ways that Indigenous people share stories by storytelling to drive this work forward in community. So when that final report is available, there is a great ordeal of oral storytelling included in there to really get grounded in what the Celix community is all about, their values, tradition, and their culture, to learn about how this ICA was developed and how it is so different from the traditional VAT scores, and that Indigenous people in Kelowna will really benefit from a Indigenous coordinated access model moving forward. We can go to the next slide. So the prioritization piece of this, we really wanted to prioritize that you're more than your VAT score, you're more than your story. So we really nailed down in tying that in the Indigenous community, that familial roots and ties are the most important to find relations in community, even with members who aren't of your own bloodline. So we really looked at that piece and made that an important prioritization piece, that even though you are disconnected from your community, that there is a lot of supports in community there for you to access services. And it's very strengths-based as opposed to how our traditional VAT scores are being placed and just numbered on that piece. So including that is super awesome, and I'm excited to see where this project goes in the future.
Oh, sorry about that. Were you good?
Yeah, that's everything. Yeah.
That's it. Yeah. So this prioritization one is kind of the one that strikes me. I don't know if other folks have done work in the homelessness sector, but prioritization in the housing sector is done through these tools that have, and I won't name them so that for legal reasons, but when you actually look at them from an equity perspective, they tend to under prioritize equity seeking groups and racialized groups. And so to do a project where it's driven by community and the prioritization process and criteria is determined by the community instead of top down by policy is something very novel. And I think it's gonna, again, we're watching this one very, very keenly because it's a really interesting example where the data creation process itself and what is considered to be data is driven by lived and living experience as well. So thank you, Taylor, and thank you for representing that today and sharing that. We do have some time for questions. Luckily, I saw one about I believe it's about the TRC question, and I believe somebody was asking which TRC calls to action we were referring to. So what I'll actually do is say that it's not just one call to action. There's actually couple hundred calls to action relevant to data, and I'll show you what I mean by that, and encourage you to do kind of this deep dig as part of your reconciliation work. So here's the TRC, it's in the TRC here is in the red, and then we analyze it essentially. Is this to do with access to appropriate supports, access to funding and resourcing, data transparency? So you can see that there's actually quite a lot to do with data transparency in the TRC. So I wasn't referring to specifically one of these. I was referring to there's actually quite a few. And then of course the data transparency, public accountability, there's some that are to do with policies, and some of them are to do with private sector versus provincial territorial governments. So we need to be able to understand or reflect on what we can do through data to advance the TRC much more than, just doing the tick mark, and to what extent has been that call to action been implemented in these entities as well, and do we have the data even to report on that? Lots of it, for instance, on child welfare has to do with our parity in terms of investigations, but we also know that lots of those investigations the data has been not even public, and so even the Pope being in Edmonton today, one of the asks is open up the records. There's lots and lots of calls to action to do with data access, so that we can then analyze and see what the data is been kind of holding hidden for hundreds of years. So that's what I was referring to. Let's see if we've got another question in here. Information. Oh, there's some more questions for ICA. Very interested in this model and what prioritization tools to use. So where can folks find out more about that, Taylor, or can they just call and bug you for it?
Yeah, for now they can just email us, because I don't think Kelowna shared it publicly yet. We're still working on the next steps and building out the process in community.
Okay. And it looks like you guys like that ugly spreadsheet I showed you. We're happy to share it. It's just where we track how we're working towards the TRC calls to action. If it's useful, I'll give you my number on the last slide. Wendy and Sylvia, I want to give you guys an opportunity, having listened to the conversation, any reflections and any kind of parting insights that you want to share with the participants, having listened to the discussion today. And maybe I'll hand it to you, Wendy, first, and then Sylvia, just because Sylvia, you opened us, so you get to close us as well.
Yeah, no, thanks very much for the opportunity. And I think you got sort of the full range of perspectives, from the why about data, examples, and then the tools that can certainly help. And I know that, from my point of view, the ability to use unstructured data and to actually look at semantic analysis and so on, absolutely critically important. And especially, one of the projects we have right now is tackling online hate. We have another one looking at stereotypes in the media, and having sophisticated tools to allow us to really look at patterns is critically important in that space. So really appreciate the power of the approach that you're proposing.
And I've thoroughly enjoyed all of this and learning more, but Taylor, in particular, your sharing of not only the work that you did with the Indigenous community and Indigenous elders in Kelowna, but also the thoughtfulness with which you did it, I think was really powerful. The blending of data and cultural sensitivity, I think is amazing. And if you haven't, big fan for a data walks process, privilege of leading both so virtual, allow perspectives to equally come together and look at a set and begin to make sense of what it means, and also sort of how it might lead in a deeper, less reactive way. So I loved how you centered people and sense making in alongside the data. I think that's sort of the magic for systems change.
There we go. Thanks. Thank you, guys. Of course, we wouldn't be HelpSeeker if we didn't push our next webinar. So here's a little reminder of what's one of them. We haven't set the date yet, but don't worry, we will bug you for it. So we do have one on August 11 coming up with in partnership with CMHC. This one's to do with housing, and there's of course going to be equity level level insights there, because we're going to be launching a free account to one of our software products to support some of this advocacy work. And that's again on August 11. So watch out for that. CMHC is running that show, but we can send you guys information about that. And again, it's going to be a great tool to connect the dots when it comes to housing and housing affordability and looking at it from a pan-Canadian perspective. And then in September, we haven't set the date yet, but I will put in a plug for this too. HelpSeeker is part of the Systems Planning Collective with Away Home Canada and the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness. So this one's going to have a focus on homeless serving systems of care, and our perspective is going to be on tech innovations and what we've learned in the last 3 years, mapping Canada's homeless serving systems. But of course, Steve and Mel from those other organizations will be sharing their insights as well. So look out for that one as well. And of course, please throw us in the chat any questions or follow-ups that we should be doing with all of you. Today's recording will of course be shared. The slides, we're going to put them all together in a nice package for you as well. And it sounds like I've got some ugly Excel sheet requests that I need to be following up on. So I'll take a look at those too. But yeah, by all means, everybody do get in touch. We're here to support. And if there's questions about data, questions about tech applications to systems change and equitable systems change, and more importantly, we're more than happy to have those follow-up conversations with you and your organization too. Awesome. I want to thank you, Wendy, Taylor, and Sylvia for wonderful insights. I think we got a beautiful assortment of approaches, and hopefully that brought some new ideas to our listeners on this beautiful July. Thank you so much, everybody, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye.